right. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk about a very controversial subject, and it's not a subject really for children. It's a grown-up subject, so I don't want any children to watch this video. But it's an important subject that's related to the other video that we made earlier about which wasn't really the subject of the video, but seemed to be the crux of the issue that a lot of people were focused on in the video, is when I made a statement that one's beliefs are not really a choice. And not to say that beliefs don't change. They absolutely do change. But when someone's in a certain state of belief, it's usually not a matter of choice as much as a matter of generally that someone is for some reason convinced of something. Now, it could be, again, when we go back to, this is a separate issue than what really the main controversial issue is, that I think might get this video banned. It might get flagged or something. It's not my intention. It's going against the standard left-wing Western orthodoxy, certainly, but not. I don't intend this in any way to be hateful, or certainly not to encourage violence. It's exactly the opposite. Is the purpose of why I want to bring up this subject. But I do think it's important to bring up and to discuss. But before I get there, again, it's these issues of belief before we get to the other more controversial issue, we could say, is that belief, I think, is something different than blind faith. People often believe things that they believe based on their own experience or on information that they receive. Certainly my faith is, I believe, a rational faith. I understand that other people see it differently. But in my worldview, I find it rational to believe that if a claim was made that millions of people heard God speak at Mount Sinai, that would be a difficult claim to make if it did not truly happen. And if the Bible says that Moses tells us that he dares us to search world history and lore to see if a similar story was ever even claimed, was ever even heard of, let alone happened, and yet he makes this claim, and study of world religion and various lore bears out that no similar claim was ever made that entire nations should hear the voice of God and live. So to me, it's a rational thing to believe that God spoke at Mount Sinai. And at that point where I see it as a rational belief, it's very difficult for me to not believe that. And that's kind of what I mean, that the belief is not a choice. Similarly, when it comes to, in politics, political views, I would say, and again, is it a proof that God spoke at Mount Sinai? No. But it's something that I believe to be rational and I'm convinced of, and then in light of other experiences, personal experiences, and my personal feelings about my faith, you have that combination of experience and apologetics, for lack of a better term, that combine to the point where I don't have a choice to go and believe in another religion. I can be curious about the other religions. I can study other religions. I can have conversations with people from other religions. I can even appreciate other religions, but it's hard for me to believe in any other religion. Now, other religions do ask for blind faith as far as certain tenets of their faith. They might appeal to certain things that are not logical. And in general, people believe in those religions who believe in them truly, deeply, and strongly believe in those religions. A lot of it, again, has to do with their own personal experiences with these religions, the way it makes them feel, etc. And so I don't really think that this aspect of things being logical makes one religion superior to another. It just, for me personally, I think, this is my religion, and I would like to hope that it wouldn't just be because I happen to be born to a Jewish mother. I really, as much as I'm very convinced that this is the true religion, but also the way of life that this religion gives us is very satisfaction. It gives a lot of satisfaction and so forth. But the truth is, when it comes to those aspects, I would say really probably all religions are equal in that to people that are devoted to those faiths, they receive tremendous satisfaction from those devotions, and that also colors their beliefs. In addition to their study of the apologetics of those faiths, which would also be convincing in other aspects, and it's generally a combination of both the apologetic arguments and the personal, emotional satisfaction that a religious tradition gives to the devotee, that gives the person their connections to this. And so too, we see this in the pagan religions, and we see these in the non-theistic approaches to the world. A lot of atheists are very proud to be atheists and feel a very strong emotional, not only a rational attachment, but an emotional one. They might feel pride from this belief. They might feel other forms of satisfaction. And again, these things generally are not a matter of choice as to why someone believes something. Now, people can make a choice whether or not to profess a belief publicly. There's a lot of discussion in the pagan circles of being, quote unquote, in the broom closet because they're afraid, let's say, people who grew up Christian and became joined some neo-pagan group, or even self-initiated into a neo-pagan belief and might not have joined any community, as generally would be the case in someone in this approach. They're making a choice. Perhaps it's based on their community connections and so forth, meaning their beliefs are their beliefs. They might have stopped believing in the faith that they were raised in, and that's not maybe a choice of that belief, but they could make the choice whether or not to profess that belief, to publicly profess that belief, and so forth. And that indeed is a choice. And it's the same thing with politics. I mean, I was presented both with the evidence of some political view, particularly in that's in current events that is ineffable and we're not allowed to mention here on YouTube, about something that a historical event, and And the other side just made the claim that, well, this is it. They don't really bring any evidence for their claim, but they just say this is what happened, without any evidence, and without any refutation of the claims that I find to be convincing. But there's also the emotional attachment and the satisfaction that's attached to that. And again, I don't think you're going to convince people one way or the other. However, their political views are connected to these questions and current events. And part of it is even being part of the community. I mean, the fact of the matter is, not only my religious community, a lot of people would share these political beliefs, but even my work community. I'm surrounded by people who agree with me. At work, I would say the vast majority of my coworkers profess to share certain beliefs about a particular historical event that took place in November. You know what we're talking about. That which is ineffable, that which may not be mentioned, yet lest we be banned from the sacred halls of YouTube, which I really don't. I don't want to be banned. I like this platform, and I am also enticed by the fact that if perhaps I get to a point where I have whatever it is, I don't know, 4,000 hours of views once again within a year. Not one, I didn't have it before, but I used to get a check every now and then from Google for my YouTube channel for the commercials that they put on here, the ads, and that stopped. It's probably about 2 or 3 years now that they changed their algorithm, and they said you have to have 1,000 subscribers. I got there, but I didn't get. But you also have to have 4,000 hours of views. Did not get there yet, but we're working toward it. Or 4,000 minutes. I don't remember what it was. It was a certain number that you have to get to, and that I haven't gotten to yet. But I'm enticed that if I still keep making this content, maybe someday I'll get another check for $100 in the mail here and there, which is nice to get every now and then, you know. So even though, you know, I can put in a lot less effort to make that money doing other things, but I enjoy this platform, so I really don't. And also, I've invested so much time and energy into this. It's been a labor of love. I don't, you know, but I am afraid that they're going to kick me off of this platform. So there is a fear. But we try our best to follow the rules. And it makes me afraid, though, to talk about the other subject that I wanted to talk about. But let's talk about this political subject. You know, a lot of people are accusing a particular figure who's central to this political movement of being responsible for spreading that which the other side labels as misinformation. But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of people who believe this particular belief about a particular historical event, which will remain nameless, would believe so whether or not this particular figure who's prominent believed it or not, or pushed this information or not. And he really didn't push the bulk of the information, but the information that he presented I find to be convincing. And you know, when I heard it, I had already heard it before I heard it from him. He was merely echoing things that we know, and all the things that he said, all the evidence that he brought is verifiable and true, but it is what it is. But again, people are being discriminated against for holding this belief and professing this belief, and I'm making a choice now to censor myself because I value the YouTube community. But people know what I'm talking about. as far as the political issues, as far as the historical issues that we are discussing here. When we get to the other issue, though, that it came out, and I'm very scared that if I talk about this, and this was the disclaimer of it being a grown-up discussion, not a kid's discussion, is this issue of how a certain percentage, it came out, a study was made about how higher percentages of individuals identify with the LGBTQ community, and particularly in the, I guess they call Generation Z, and the post-millennial generation, or the millennial generation, or whatever. I don't know which generations is which, whatever it is. Or is that my generation? I don't know which one. I don't know what the generations are called. And when you get into the details of this study, what you find, and this I just read on Twitter, but this is all what's presented in the study, the vast majority of those who would, they're just lumping LGBTQ all together as one group, but the vast majority of the people who would be listed there and who have this identity or are professing this identity and so forth, we find are living, I guess, what would be called heteronormative lives, but are recognizing perhaps a latent bisexuality in themselves, but are either, the majority of their relationships are with members of the opposite sex and the opposite gender, and both, whether they're in a committed relationship or just in general relationships. And when it's presented in that manner, meaning you don't have a big spike in people who identify particularly as gay or lesbian, and it's uncomfortable to talk about these subjects. I prefer not to. And actually, they find that the lesbian community has shrunk, and the transgender female to male community has grown. That a lot of people who would identify or would have identified as lesbian a generation back are now identifying, perhaps due to therapy or whatever it is, or the culture change, with the transgender community as female to male transgender, as opposed to being lesbian. But the bisexual issue, but that's a minor issue, and it's still very small. But this bisexual issue, this big spike, are in people who recognize either a latent bisexuality or an active bisexuality, but who live generally a heterosexual lifestyle. So it's not really a major change. It's just the labeling. It comes down to the identity politics, that they want to be able to say, oh, people identify with a particular group. And again, this identity, it wouldn't be very different than things you find in the Kinsey studies in the 1950s. It's just that people didn't identify themselves based on sexuality as much as is encouraged today. It's a culture change. It's not really as much of a actual change in the demographic population. More or less, how does a culture view these various things, and how do people identify and so forth, as well as the other aspects of the culture that, again, is nothing new in the culture, but people are maybe more comfortable with these different ideas. The only reason that I'm bringing this up as a rabbi is that really people need to know at least the biblical, at least what we call the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as the Christians would call, we don't call it the Old Testament biblical view, is that there is no such thing in the Hebrew biblical worldview as an identity that is based on one's sexual activity. There is no such noun in the Hebrew language, classical Hebrew language, for a homosexual individual, for a human being who identifies as a homosexual or even who practices homosexuality. And for good measure, in the Christian Bible, what Christians call the New Testament, there is one passage, and that passage does not refer to the type of identity politics that we know of today, but rather more along the lines of a descriptive term for people who engage in these activities. And so again, it wouldn't be in the way that it exists today, that you have the community and the identity and the identity politics, as much as the way that things were really in ancient Greece, where that's just how people lived. That was the culture, and that was the, it wasn't a matter of this is who someone is. You didn't have this idea just because people engaged in a certain practice that therefore they are gay or straight or bisexual. That was just a natural form of life, that's that, and their culture was like that most people engaged in both heterosexual and homosexual activity in ancient Greece, and this was frowned upon and viewed as sinful in the Hebrew culture. And it was more, and one thing was that in the Talmud you have the fear of people were warned in the Jewish community, don't leave your boys alone with the pagans who practice these type of actions, because then they would become acclimated to that culture. But the point that I'm bringing out here is that there was no idea of someone being identified, whether it comes by nature or nurture, that someone identifies in this manner. It was not an issue that was in the way that it is today in the West, and it really wasn't so neither in the biblical Hebrew culture, nor was it in the pagan Greek or Roman culture. It's just that in the pagan Greek and Roman culture, that was part of the culture, and in the Hebrew culture, it was frowned upon, it was banned, it was not something that was supposed to be part of the culture, although people who practice certain pagan traditions did incorporate into their culture. But the main point of what I'm bringing out is that there is no idea in the biblical worldview of someone being gay or being straight. These are seen as behavior and not as an identity with identity politics. Were there sexual minorities? Yes, there were eunuchs, there were intersex people. Certainly in the Talmud, there's discussion of intersex people, the androgynous and the tumtum, and even though the one that's called the tumtum would be the androgyne. These were Greek terms, at least androgynous was. So, again, when people say, it's not a choice and this and that, it's a choice as to whether or not one is going to make identity politics out of these feelings or these behaviors. And behavior is also choice, but it's a different part of the choice. But it's the same thing here. Just like one can choose to identify with a religious community or not identify with it, no matter what their feelings are, which are not immutable, but not a matter of choice, as opposed to here, you know, that's the issue. I don't really have time to talk more. But thanks for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment. We'll see you later.